Now, Egypt. The year is approximately 1446 BC, though the date has been debated by scholars for 2 centuries, and we will not settle it here. What is not debated is this: by the time the book of Exodus opens, the descendants of Abraham have been in Egypt for 430 years. 430. Let that number breathe for a moment. That is longer than the United States has existed as a nation. That is so many generations of the same suffering that the people living inside it had no personal memory of anything else. They were born into slavery. Their parents were born into slavery. Their grandparents were born into slavery. Freedom was not a faded memory. Freedom was a story someone's ancestor had told someone's ancestor, passed down through so many mouths that it had begun to feel more like legend than history. And it was getting worse. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century A.D., describes the conditions of Israelite labor in Egypt in terms that are almost impossible to read. In his Antiquities of the Jews, he records that the Israelites were forced into the most brutal construction projects the ancient world had ever attempted, cutting stone, hauling it across miles of desert, building cities for a pharaoh who viewed them as livestock with hands. He describes deliberate policies designed to break families, to exhaust bodies beyond recovery. And then came the order about the babies. Every son born to a Hebrew woman, thrown into the Nile. This is the world the book of Exodus opens into. Not hardship, not difficulty. Systematic, generational, industrial-scale destruction of a people. And the text, in one of the most restrained and devastating sentences in all of Scripture, simply says the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. That word, cried out. In Hebrew, it is zi'aka. Zi'aka is not a prayer. It is not a petition submitted to heaven through proper channels. The rabbis of the Talmud record a striking tradition. By this point in their captivity, the Israelites had largely stopped praying in any formal sense. They had been crushed for so long that organized religious expression had been ground out of them. What came out of Egypt that day was not liturgy. He knew. And then, 40 years into the Sinai wilderness on the backside of a mountain nobody important had ever visited, tending a flock that belonged to his father-in-law, an 80-year-old shepherd named Moses, stops walking because a bush is on fire and it is not burning up. And God speaks. I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them. 4 verbs. Count them. I have seen. I have heard. I am concerned. I have come down. Each one a step closer. Each one more active than the last. The seeing leads to the hearing, leads to the knowing, leads to the movement. God is not announcing a feeling. He is announcing a sequence. He has been watching. He has been listening. He has entered into the weight of it. And now he is moving. The burning bush is not the miracle of this story. The miracle is what God says at the burning bush, that after 430 years, after generations of suffering that would have made any reasonable observer conclude that heaven had simply looked away, God looks at an 80-year-old shepherd and says, I have seen this the whole time, and I have come down. Here's the part nobody tells you about Moses in this moment. He is not a young man fired up for revolution. He is 80 years old. He spent 40 years as a prince in the palace he was supposed to liberate his people from. He tried once, young, impulsive, disastrously, and it ended with a man dead and Moses running for his life. He has had 40 years to conclude that he was not the person for this, that the moment had passed, that whatever calling he once felt had been buried in the Midian desert under 4 decades of quiet and sheep and the slow accumulation of a smaller life than he had imagined. And God finds him here, not in his prime, not at the beginning of his story, at the far end of it when the fire had gone out, because God's I have seen is never governed by our sense of timing. The bush burns, the voice speaks, and a man who had given up on his own calling takes his sandals off on holy ground and discovers that God had been watching both of them, him and his people, far longer than either of them knew. Now leave Egypt. Leave the wilderness of Sinai. Travel 800 years forward in time to a different wilderness, a scrubby patch of desert in the southern kingdom of Israel, near a place called Beersheba, and find a man lying under a broom tree, asking God to let him die. His name is Elijah. 24 hours ago, or close to it, Elijah stood on the top of Mount Carmel and called down fire from heaven in front of 450 prophets of Baal and the entire watching nation of Israel. The fire came. The prophets fell. The people fell on their faces and declared that the Lord, He is God. It was the single most dramatic public miracle in the history of the northern kingdom. And now Elijah is under a broom tree asking God to kill him. I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. If you have ever stood at the top of something, a project, a season of life where everything you worked for came together exactly right, and then found yourself, weeks later, more depleted and more empty than you have ever been, then you already understand Elijah under the broom tree better than any commentary can explain it. The adrenaline of the mountain had collapsed into a darkness so total he could not see through it. Queen Jezebel had issued a death warrant with his name on it. He had run a full day's journey into the wilderness alone, and the conclusion he had reached under that tree, in that desert, with the sun going down, was that it was finished. He was finished. Here is what God does not do. He does not appear in a whirlwind of rebuke. He does not send an angel with a theological correction. He does not say, Elijah, don't you remember what just happened on that mountain? Don't you know who you are? He sends an angel with bread, freshly baked bread, warm from coals, and a jar of water. The angel touches Elijah on the shoulder, gently, the way you touch someone who is sleeping rather than someone who needs to be shaken, and says, Get up and eat. Elijah eats. Elijah lies back down. The angel comes a second time, touches him again, and says 7 words that I have thought about more times than I can count. Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. Not, get up and stop feeling sorry for yourself. Not, get up because people are counting on you. Not, get up because you have a calling to fulfill and a nation to serve and a God to represent. Get up because the journey is too much for you and you need food for the road. God looked at the greatest prophet in Israel's history, collapsed in the desert, asking to die. And his response was not a sermon. It was not a rebuke. It was bread and water and 7 words of the most matter-of-fact compassion in all of Scripture. The journey is too much for you. He saw. He knew. He did not explain the suffering or justify it or reframe it into something more spiritually acceptable. He simply acknowledged it. The journey is too much, and he fed him anyway. And this is where it gets remarkable. Elijah gets up. Not fixed, not fully restored, not returned to the man he had been on the mountain. He gets up, eats, and walks. 40 days and 40 nights through the wilderness to the mountain of God, still broken, still depleted, still carrying the weight of a man who has been running from a death threat with nothing in his chest but exhaustion, but walking. Sometimes that is what I have seen you produces. Not a miraculous transformation, not a sudden restoration of everything that was lost, just enough bread for the next 40 days. Just enough water for the road ahead, just enough to get up, just enough. Think about the last time you sat in a waiting room. Not a pleasant waiting room with magazines and soft music. The other kind, the kind where the chairs are too hard and the fluorescent lights are too bright, and everyone in the room is holding the same thing, a fear they cannot say out loud. A hospital waiting room, an ICU family lounge, the kind of room where time moves differently, where every set of footsteps in the corridor makes every head turn, where the whole room holds its breath every time a door opens. And then a doctor walks through that door, and in the half-second before they speak, in that sliver of time between the door opening and the first word leaving their mouth, they make eye contact with you. Not the room, not the cluster of people by the window. You, and in that fraction of a second, with a certainty that bypasses every rational process in your brain, that they have seen your situation, that they know which name is on the chart, that they have come specifically, deliberately, for you. That moment, that split second between invisible and found, is the emotional center of everything we have been tracing today. It is what Hagar felt at the spring on the road to Shur. It is what Leah felt when she held Reuben for the first time and understood why she had been given him. It is what Moses felt on the backside of a mountain when a bush caught fire and a voice said,